In the heart of the city, Judge Charles Preston sat at the bench, his mind focused on the upcoming cases of the day, a mix of minor traffic violations and petty disputes. He had long since lost any real excitement for his daily work. He had seen it all before, and after years of presiding over the courtroom, it had become routine. The cases blurred together, and in his memory, each one as forgettable as the last. His reputation among his peers was solid. He was known for his strict adherence to the law and his refusal to entertain any form of leniency or excuses. He ran a tight courtroom and had little patience for those who didn't respect the rules. He believed in fairness above all and was proud of his reputation for being impartial. That morning, a new case was brought before him. A woman named Maria Edwards, a calm, poised black woman in her late 30s, who stood accused of running a stop sign. While driving, she was a lawyer and a well-known figure in the local legal community, though not enough for Judge Preston to recognize her on sight. He listened as the prosecutor presented the case. It seemed clear enough Maria had been caught by a traffic camera as she failed to stop at an intersection. The evidence was straightforward. The case would be simple, and it seemed obvious to the judge that she had made an honest mistake. But he wasn't one for leniency, and he didn't have time for explanations or excuses. He wasn't in the mood to entertain stories of road confusion or bad luck. When Maria spoke in her defense, her tone was calm, her voice steady, as she explained that the stop sign in question was difficult to see due to the overgrown trees blocking it and how there had been a construction site on the corner that made it harder to notice the sign. She provided her evidence, a map showing the location of the stop sign in question and how difficult it could be for drivers to notice it. He listened, but the judge was unmoved by her explanation. He had heard it all before, the same tired justifications over and over. He had no patience for stories of faulty roads or obstructed views. It was irrelevant in his mind. The law was the law, and if a person broke it, they should pay the price, no matter the circumstances. He glanced at the clock and made up his mind. Quickly, the case was a simple one, and he wasn't about to waste time on details. He handed down the fine, a hefty one, far more than the typical penalty for such a violation. He justified it in his mind by thinking that the fine would send a message about the importance of following traffic laws. He told Maria that it was her responsibility to be aware of her surroundings, and that her explanation didn't excuse her actions. Without giving her much time to speak further, he dismissed her from the stand and moved on to the next case, his decision final and firm. Maria stood silently before him for a moment as the gavel came down, and she was dismissed from the courtroom without a word of protest. She gathered her papers and walked out the door, her head held high, though inside she was simmering with frustration. But she had learned long ago that fighting against the system directly rarely yielded any results. It wasn't the first time she had faced a biased decision, and it wouldn't be the last, but she knew this case wasn't over yet. In the back of her mind, she already knew she would take action in a way that the judge would not expect. As Maria walked out of the courthouse, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just gone terribly wrong. It wasn't just about the fine or the fact that she had been treated unfairly. It was the sense that she had been dismissed in a way that felt more personal than professional. Judge Preston hadn't even given her the courtesy of listening to her full defense. He had shut her down quickly, as though he had already made up his mind before she even opened her mouth to speak. The thought bothered her, but she remained calm, her composure, a shield she had learned to wear over the years when dealing with the injustices that lurked in every corner of the legal world. Outside the courthouse, Maria paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the cool air as she adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder. She had been down this road before, but there was something different about this situation. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Judge Preston's decision wasn't just an isolated incident. It felt like part of a larger pattern of dismissing people like her who were trying to make real change in the legal system. She couldn't help but feel that the fact she was a black woman in a position of power played a role in how she was treated, but she knew better than to react hastily. She wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. As she walked toward the parking lot, she overheard a conversation between two attorneys standing by the courthouse entrance, their voices low but clearly audible. "Did you hear about Maria Edwards? One of them asked the other, "She's the new president of the Bar Association, you know, the one who just took over last month." The second attorney looked surprised. "Wait, you mean asterisk, that asterisk Maria Edwards, the one who was just fined for running a stop sign? That's her, the one who's been making headlines with all these civil rights cases." "Yes, exactly, that's the one," the first attorney replied with a touch of awe. "She's already shaking things up in the legal community, and now she's at the top of the Bar Association." Maria froze for a moment as she heard the conversation. Her name was being spoken with a tone of respect and admiration, something that seemed at odds with the way she had just been treated in Judge Preston's courtroom. She hadn't expected the news of her role at the Bar Association to spread so quickly, but now that she heard it in the mouths of others, she realized the magnitude of her position. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a leader, someone with influence who could change the course of the city's legal landscape, and yet here she was being dismissed by a judge as if she were just another ordinary citizen. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Judge Preston had no idea who he was dealing with. He had made a critical mistake in underestimating her, not because of her legal acumen, but because he had failed to recognize her as a powerful figure in the legal community, someone who could challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As Maria got into her car, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let one misguided decision define her or her future in the legal world. But she also wasn't going to let the judge get away with it without facing some kind of reckoning. The fine might have been the beginning of something much bigger than he realized. It was time for her to take action, and she knew exactly how to do it. She put the car in gear and drove off, her mind already racing with ideas for what came next. The days following the incident at the courthouse felt like a blur for Maria. She spent her time back in her office, poring over case files and attending meetings with her colleagues at the Bar Association, but her mind kept drifting back to Judge Preston's ruling. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the way he had dismissed her, not even giving her the courtesy of considering her explanation. That had stung more than the financial penalty. As the week wore on, the story of Maria's fine began to spread throughout the legal community, and before long, it became a topic of heated discussion. News outlets began picking up on the story, with the headline, "Judge Fines Prominent Black Lawyer for Minor Traffic Violation," which quickly sparked a wave of reactions. On social media, people were questioning the fairness of the ruling, and many commentators pointed out that it felt like another case of bias from a figure in power, unconscious or otherwise. Maria's name, already well known in the civil rights community for her relentless work fighting for justice and equality, was suddenly being discussed in a new context. The story wasn't just about a traffic fine anymore. It was about a woman of power being unjustly treated by a man in a position of authority. Some posts called for Maria to challenge the fine, others called for Judge Preston to resign, but there was an overwhelming feeling that this was a symptom of a larger issue, one that Maria had been fighting against her entire career. It didn't take long for the press to begin digging into Judge Preston's background, with some of his past rulings coming under scrutiny. A few high-profile cases in which he had been criticized for his lack of empathy or understanding of cultural nuances resurfaced. Suddenly, people began to question whether this was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern. Some wondered whether his harsh ruling was motivated by something deeper, something implicit, that he hadn't even recognized in himself. But Maria wasn't interested in making the story about herself. She was more concerned with how to use this moment to address the larger issues at play. She knew that her status as the new head of the Bar Association gave her a platform, and she was determined to use it to bring attention to unconscious bias within the legal system, especially within the judiciary. It was time to have an honest conversation about how the system treated people, particularly people of color, and how those in power needed to recognize their own blind spots. She called an emergency meeting with her team at the Bar Association, and by the end of the day, they had already set the wheels in motion for what would come next. Maria had made up her mind. She wasn't just going to let this incident fade away. She was going to take action. She wrote a public statement, one that would call for greater accountability among judges and officials within the legal community. She didn't attack Judge Preston personally, but she made it clear that his actions were an example of how the system had to change. The statement was poised and strategic, framed not as an accusation, but as an invitation to a larger conversation about bias, power, and fairness in the law. Before she released the statement, Maria took a moment to reflect. The world was watching her, and how she responded would shape not only her career, but the future of the Bar Association and the legal system. She knew this wasn't just about one fine, it was about creating lasting change, and she was ready to make that happen. With a deep breath, she hit send. The morning after Maria released her statement, the legal community was abuzz. News outlets picked it up almost instantly, with several local TV stations broadcasting her words in prime time. Maria's call for a reckoning was clear and firm. This wasn't just about one judge's mistake. It was about a systemic issue within the judiciary that needed to be addressed. The Bar Association, under her leadership, was now taking a stand. It wasn't long before the conversation moved beyond just Judge Preston's actions to include the broader implications of racial bias and privilege within the courtroom. Judge Preston, who had originally dismissed the incident as nothing more than a routine case, found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't expected. The press began to dig into his past decisions, and more than one article raised questions about his lack of cultural awareness. His colleagues, some of whom had quietly supported him in the past, were now faced with difficult conversations about whether his decisions had unintentionally perpetuated injustices. For days, the local news focused on the fallout. Editorials criticized him for his insensitivity, while others pointed out that his heavy-handed approach to the fine might have been rooted in an unconscious bias against a black woman in a position of power. Maria's supporters rallied behind her, posting messages of encouragement on social media, and many local community leaders called for Judge Preston to reflect on his actions and offer an apology. Despite the growing pressure, Judge Preston continued to deny any wrongdoing. He publicly defended his decision, insisting that his ruling had been based on the facts of the case. But the more he read the articles, the more uneasy he became. He had always prided himself on being fair and impartial, yet the weight of the mounting criticism made him wonder whether he had missed something crucial. Was his decision really based purely on the law, or had something else influenced it? He knew his career could be in jeopardy if the public continued to question his impartiality. That night, Judge Preston sat in his office, his head in his hands, as he sifted through more reports on the controversy. He had heard the whispers over the years, the subtle comments from colleagues who had questioned his understanding of diversity, the occasional suggestion that he had a tendency to overlook the nuances of race and class in his rulings. But he had always dismissed those concerns. He had thought of himself as a man of principle, a judge who followed the law above all else. Now, for the first time, those criticisms seemed to have more weight. His mind returned to Maria's calm yet unwavering confrontation when she had met him in private. She had spoken with such confidence, challenging his decision not as an adversary, but as someone who sought to make him aware of his biases. In that moment, Judge Preston had felt something shift within him. She had made him question his own assumptions, the very assumptions that had guided his career. He knew he had to act, but he wasn't sure how. Maria, on the other hand, wasn't waiting for him to make the first move. She had already planned her next step. A public apology, she knew, wouldn't be enough. She needed to engage in a dialogue with the judiciary, one that would encourage real change. The wheels were already in motion within the Bar Association to create training programs focused on unconscious bias, diversity, and inclusion within the legal system. But that wasn't all. Maria knew the system needed more than just policy changes. She needed to change the way judges thought about power, privilege, and fairness. And she was determined to use her position to make sure that change happened. Days turned into a week, and the pressure on Judge Preston continued to mount. The local media didn't let up, each new broadcast amplifying the public outcry. Articles questioned not just his decision in Maria's case, but also the integrity of the judicial system as a whole. Judge Preston's refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing left many uncomfortable, as if he were unwilling to engage in self-reflection. While his supporters continued to stand by him, quietly defending his professionalism, others within the legal community began to wonder whether this was a turning point, an opportunity to create something better. It was then that Maria reached out to him directly. In a move that surprised her colleagues, she requested a private meeting with Judge Preston. She knew that this would not be just another confrontation. This was an opportunity for genuine dialogue. Judge Preston had heard of the request, but hesitated before agreeing. He was, after all, a man used to being in control. The idea of being questioned so publicly, particularly by someone in a position like Maria's, made him uneasy. But despite his discomfort, something in him told him to meet her. When the day arrived, Maria walked into Judge Preston's office with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. She was calm, poised, and unyielding in her mission to bring about change. As she entered the room, Judge Preston stood up from behind his desk, a subtle sign of respect he rarely gave anyone. He had read her statement, seen the public reaction, and knew that this meeting wasn't just about a traffic fine. It was about confronting the biases that plagued his profession. "Judge," Maria began, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. This isn't just about a fine. It's about something much larger than either of us." Judge Preston nodded, his face slightly flushed. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such directness. "I realize that," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "It's clear that I've caused an unintended stir. I've been thinking about this a lot lately." Maria sat across from him, choosing her words carefully. "I want to make it clear, Judge, that this is not a personal attack. It's about accountability and fairness. It's about making sure the system works for everyone. And that includes making sure that people in positions of power recognize how unconscious bias can affect their decisions, even when they don't mean for it to." Judge Preston stared at her for a long moment. It was clear that he hadn't expected her to be so calm, so composed in this meeting. He had braced himself for confrontation, but instead, he was facing someone who was simply asking for accountability, a concept he hadn't fully grasped before now. "I've been reading the reports," Judge Preston said slowly, "and I'll admit, I didn't handle this well. I thought I was simply enforcing the law. But maybe I missed something. Maybe I failed to recognize what was at play." Maria smiled, but it wasn't one of victory. It was a smile of understanding. "It's not just about this case, Judge. We have a responsibility, all of us in the legal field, to examine the biases we may carry, whether we are aware of them or not. I'm asking for change, but that change starts with a willingness to look inward. And I think you have the potential to lead that change, if you're willing." The judge's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair. "What do you propose?" Maria took a breath. "I propose that we begin by acknowledging that bias exists within the system. We can start with training programs for judges, sessions on recognizing unconscious bias, how it affects our judgments, and how we can do better. I'm not asking for you to admit anything you don't believe to be true, but I am asking for an open mind." Judge Preston, for the first time in a long while, felt unsure. He had spent his career thinking of the law as something absolute, a set of rules that could be applied uniformly. But Maria had shown him, through her calm persistence and insight, that perhaps the law was not the only thing that needed to be upheld. The integrity of those who enforced it, their ability to listen and reflect, mattered just as much. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I'll consider it. More than that, I'll work on it. I'm willing to open myself up to what you've suggested. If it helps, then I'll be a part of it." Maria's heart swelled, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her effort was beginning to make an impact. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a beginning. And that, in itself, was worth fighting for. The meeting with Judge Preston marked a pivotal moment in Maria's journey. It was the first time she had seen a judge, especially one with so much authority, acknowledge the possibility of personal growth and transformation. It wasn't a complete victory, not yet, but it was a step toward breaking down the walls of resistance that had been entrenched in the legal system for so long. In the weeks that followed, Maria worked diligently with the Bar Association, to develop a series of training modules on unconscious bias and diversity within the legal profession. She brought in experts on racial justice, law enforcement reform, and social psychology to guide the process. It wasn't an easy task, and many of her colleagues were skeptical. Some judges quietly questioned whether the training would actually make a difference, while others feared that it would open a Pandora's box they weren't ready to deal with. But Maria remained undeterred. She knew this was a necessary step, not just for her career, but for the future of the legal system itself. Meanwhile, Judge Preston took Maria's words to heart. He attended the first of the training sessions, sitting in the back of the room with a stoic expression as a group of legal experts presented findings about racial bias in the courtroom. For the first time in his career, he found himself truly listening, really absorbing what was being said. As one speaker, a psychologist with years of experience in racial bias research, shared an anecdote about a judge's unconscious bias affecting sentencing decisions, Preston felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always prided himself on his impartiality, but what if he had missed something subtle yet profound, that had shaped his rulings over the years? The sessions were uncomfortable for many judges. Maria noticed the shifting postures, the discomfort, the subtle resistance. But she also noticed something else. There were conversations happening in the halls after the sessions. Judges who had once been silent or dismissive of such topics were now engaging in dialogue. Some were asking questions, others were seeking advice, and a few even approached her directly to apologize for their earlier skepticism. But it was Judge Preston who surprised her the most. After a few weeks of attending the sessions, he came to Maria with a request to meet again. They sat in the same room where they had first spoken, but this time there was a different energy. Preston seemed more open, less defensive. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, "and about the training. I'll admit I didn't understand the depth of the issue before, but now I see things differently." Maria listened carefully, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I've been making changes to the way I approach my cases," Judge Preston continued, his voice quieter now, less authoritative. "I've started to ask myself questions I never considered before about how my decisions might be influenced by things I don't even realize. I've been more aware of the need to listen to the full context of each case instead of just looking at the facts on paper. It's a slow process, but I'm working on it." Maria felt a quiet relief settle in her chest. This wasn't an apology, but it was something more valuable: acknowledgement and a commitment to change. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of optimism about the potential for progress within the legal system. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but the dialogue had been opened. "I'm glad to hear that, Judge," Maria said, her tone warm but measured. "I know it's not easy to confront things that we don't want to see in ourselves, but that's the only way we'll grow. And the more we grow, the better we'll serve the people we're meant to protect." Judge Preston nodded slowly. "I'll continue with the training, and I want to help spread the message, not just within my court, but beyond it. If we can make this work, maybe we can change the way things are done here." Maria smiled. That's the start of something real. As she left his office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning, one that had the potential to change the future of the legal system for generations to come. As the months passed, Maria's efforts within the Bar Association began to bear fruit. The training on unconscious bias and diversity, which had initially been met with resistance, had now become a staple of continuing education for lawyers, judges, and legal staff across the city. More and more legal professionals were stepping up to participate in the sessions, and there was a growing recognition that this was not just about diversity for diversity's sake. It was about creating a justice system that truly served everyone, equally and fairly. Maria's leadership was beginning to reshape the conversation, both within the legal community and beyond. But she knew that true change could not come from the inside alone. The legal system was part of a larger society, and Maria was determined to push for reform on a broader scale. She worked closely with community organizations, civil rights groups, and local activists to develop a platform that would advocate for systemic change. Together, they began drafting proposals that would push for more diverse representation in the judiciary, more transparency in court rulings, and more accountability when it came to racial disparities in sentencing. It was an ambitious undertaking, but Maria was used to pushing boundaries. She had fought too long and too hard to accept the status quo, and now she was determined to bring others along with her. She knew that the road would be difficult, but she also knew that the changes she was advocating for would ripple out far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about transforming a system that had, for too long, been built on foundations of bias and inequality. Judge Preston, for his part, had continued to engage with the training and had become a vocal advocate for reform within his own court. He was still cautious, but there was no denying that he had come a long way from the judge who had dismissed Maria's case so quickly. He had begun to speak about the importance of diversity in legal practice and had even started mentoring younger judges on how to recognize and address their own biases. His involvement in the reform efforts had earned him some newfound respect, but not without controversy. Some of his colleagues still resisted the changes, unwilling to acknowledge that there was a problem at all. But with Maria's continued support and the growing pressure from community leaders, Judge Preston knew that he had a responsibility to push forward. Maria's efforts were not without their challenges. The legal establishment, though evolving, remained deeply entrenched in its ways. The proposals she and the Reform Coalition had crafted met with stiff opposition from some quarters. Conservative factions in the city's political circles argued that Maria's call for systemic change was unnecessary, even divisive. They believed that the legal system, as it stood, was sufficient, that accusations of bias were exaggerated or unfounded. Yet Maria, backed by growing public support, continued to press on. One evening, as she prepared for a major town hall where she would address the public about the need for judicial reform, Maria received a phone call that she hadn't expected. It was from the mayor's office. "Ms. Edwards," the voice on the other end said, "the mayor would like to meet with you. He's interested in hearing more about your proposals for judicial reform." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had been working tirelessly to bring her ideas into the political arena, but this was the first time a figure with such political weight had reached out to her directly. "I'll be there," Maria said, her voice steady but filled with a sense of anticipation. As she hung up, she felt a rush of excitement. This meeting could be a game changer. If she could convince the mayor to champion her cause, it would send a powerful message, one that could propel her reform efforts into the mainstream. She wasn't just advocating for change anymore. She was on the brink of creating it. The battle wasn't over, but Maria could see the beginning of a new era on the horizon. She was closer than ever to realizing her vision for a fairer, more equitable legal system. And she was ready for the fight. The meeting with the mayor was scheduled for the following week. Maria arrived at City Hall, dressed in a tailored suit, her demeanor calm yet resolute. She had prepared extensively for this moment, knowing that the weight of her words could have a lasting impact on the future of the city's legal system. The mayor's office had promised a full hearing on her proposals for judicial reform, and Maria was ready to lay out a compelling case. As she walked through the grand halls of City Hall, she was aware of how much had changed since she first stepped into the courthouse to challenge the fine. Back then, she had been a lone voice, taking on a judge who had underestimated her. Now she stood at the threshold of something much bigger, something that could change the landscape of the legal profession forever. When she entered the mayor's office, she was greeted by the mayor himself, a middle-aged man known for his practical approach to governance. His office was filled with piles of paperwork and the soft hum of city affairs, but the mayor stood up as she entered, offering her a handshake. "Ms. Edwards, thank you for coming," the mayor said with a warm smile. "I've heard a lot about the work you've been doing with the Bar Association, and I'm intrigued by your vision for judicial reform." Maria nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. What I'm proposing isn't just about addressing individual cases of bias. It's about transforming the way we approach justice as a whole. For too long, our legal system has been built on assumptions that fail to account for race, class, and background. My goal is to create a system where fairness is not just a principle, but a practice. The mayor listened intently as Maria laid out her proposals. She spoke about the need for greater diversity in the judiciary, the importance of training on unconscious bias, and the necessity of creating a more transparent system that would hold judges accountable for their actions. She outlined her vision of a legal system that was not just about enforcing laws, but about ensuring that every citizen, regardless of their background, had access to true justice. When she finished, the mayor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered her words. There was a moment of silence as he weighed the implications of her ideas. Maria could sense that the mayor was taking her seriously, but she also knew that the road ahead would be challenging. Ms. Edwards, the mayor finally spoke, his voice steady but thoughtful. I won't lie to you. What you're proposing isn't going to be easy. The political climate right now is divided, and many of my colleagues will resist these changes. But I do believe that what you're asking for is necessary. Our city's legal system must evolve, and we need leaders like you to make it happen. Maria's heart raced as she absorbed his words. So, you're willing to support this? She asked. The mayor nodded slowly. I'll do more than support it. I'm willing to back you publicly. If you're ready to push these reforms forward, I'll make sure the city council gives them serious consideration. We'll work together to bring this to a vote. For a moment, Maria couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. After months of tireless work, of battling against entrenched systems, and resisting the cynicism that so often pervaded politics, she had found an ally in a position of power. The mayor's endorsement was a game changer. This was the moment that could launch her vision into reality. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Maria said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. This means more than you know. As she left the mayor's office, she felt a wave of relief and accomplishment wash over her. The hard work was far from over, but this meeting had solidified her place at the forefront of the reform movement. With the mayor's support, she knew she had a real chance to change the system. It was no longer just about one judge or one case. It was about a future where justice truly meant equality for all. Maria had come full circle, from a simple traffic fine to leading a movement that would impact the future of law and justice. The battle was not over, but with every step forward, she knew that change was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach, and she was ready to fight for it.